Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. The guest today is educator, author, editor, and daughter of Alan Watts, Ann Watts. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
You have a very profound and interesting history, your work, your books. We're going to discuss your father and your background. Please tell us first about Ann Watts, about you. How did you come about, and what is your background from your earliest childhood memories and imaginations?
Well, that's a huge, huge range to cover. I would say that I had a very different kind of upbringing in so many ways, just given who my father was and the company that he kept and the people who were in our home and in our sphere. I just had a very different kind of experience. It's not so different for many people that we traveled a lot, and I lived in various different places. And I came from a broken home. At some point, my grandparents saw how challenging my life was, my father's parents, and they arranged for me to go and live with them in England and go to the girls' boarding school that was right next to their property. And so that was a pivotal time for me that I felt really saved my life, really, because I felt like I was going crazy as I was. And so I was there for 5 years in girls' boarding school, what the years that in America we would call high school years. And so that was very meaningful time for me. And
Did you find
Yep.
grounding in that boarding school? Was there the kind of grounding that you didn't feel at home?
Well, definitely between being in boarding school and the loving care of my grandparents, I felt, the school was like a haven for me. And it was very different because when I went to the UK, what we now call the UK, I was very mature, very adult. And I had to relearn how to be a kid, and so that was an interesting experience also, just to let go of being as grown up as I was in order to fit in, and because the people that I related to were the seniors in the school, and rather than the kids who were my own age, and that was very frowned on socially, so I really had to learn how to be a kid again.
So in a way, the intelligence and the emotional intelligence seems to have come to you through DNA. It's in the family blood.
I think you're probably right about that. I think that goes throughout my entire family. Yeah.
And tell me, now your father would be considered a great philosopher of our time, would you say?
That's what I perceive, and I'll tell you that in working on this book that my sister and I put together, reading his letters, I was amazed at his brilliance and amazed at the maturity that he had at a very young age, and it was a different kind of maturity. Like I think I had an emotional maturity very young, whereas he had a very the brilliant mind from very young. And when I was reading letters, and I would have to stop and calculate how old was he when he wrote this. Like in his early 20s, he was writing things that were just astounding. And so that was something that I got to witness in a very different way than I had witnessed growing up. It was really, I guess, revelatory for me in that way.
Now, I have so many questions that have come up, including where were all the letters? Where were they?
Well, my father's third wife, Jano, had all those letters, and she had put them in boxes in storage, and then when she died, the letters came to my sister and myself. And my sister, because I was away at the time, she took care of them and she housed them in her home in a file cabinet. And we were visiting our editor at New World Library, talking about other books that they were publishing and wanting to publish and that kind of thing. And Joan mentioned that, that's my sister, she mentioned that she had this collection of letters, and our publisher's eyes just lit up, and he said, those should be published. Mm-hmm. And so Joan and I took on that challenge to do that work ourselves, and so it was a 2.5-year labor of love doing all that, but it was an amazing adventure for us.
Now, were there letters that you had to figure out maybe some of the writing and kind of fill it in? And also, were there letters that you decided that shouldn't go in the book?
Oh, yeah. To the latter, definitely, yes. There were letters that didn't feel like they would add anything. I mean, there were so many books so many letters that we had to edit at some point. And it wasn't easy. And, our editors were wanting us to cut more, but were right with us that there were certain letters that we felt we couldn't cut. And so that was an interesting dance for all of us to figure that out. And somebody asked me if I thought we would then do another book with the other letters, and I really don't think so. I think we got the best and put the best in to the book. So,
was there any single letter that's your favorite, either in the book or not in the book?
Well, some of my favorite letters are the letters he wrote when he was really young, when he was still in his early teens and away at boarding school. They're just charming. The letters he wrote, the bulk of the letters, the biggest amount of letters are written to his parents. And he had a very loving relationship with them. And so it's just very sweet to read those letters. And he also did some drawings and illustrations that were wonderful. And I love seeing those in the book. And then in his later years, there are, well, first of all, in between all that, there are letters in which he describes when he arrives in America and how it looks to him and the beauty of the countryside. And then he describes in another letter later on his travels to California. And the way he writes almost like a painter. And so that you could just see it as you read it. And that's another thing that I loved in his letters. And then finally the political letters that he wrote in support of Native Americans and keeping the law and the police force out of the bedroom and out of marijuana and LSD type drugs, that kind of thing. And he wrote a lot of letters about all that, and then the society that he formed brought a Tibetan, the Dalai Lama's Tibetan interpreter to the U.S. and his family. And he had to write letters to make that happen. there were a lot of causes that he championed in a way that I really relate to, and so all that felt wonderful to me. And the amazing thing is that all of that stuff is so totally relevant today, and so I feel like his writing in general is relevant today, and so many people are discovering him even now, and that's pretty amazing.
Yes, I have a friend who Alan Watts is their very favorite kind of guru, so they listen to him every night before they go to sleep. Let me ask you, now we're talking with Ann Watts about her life and the recently published book, The Collected Letters of Alan Watts, by Ann and her sister Joan, published by New World Library and available at bookstores and Amazon and any other retailer where books can be purchased. And what's interesting is that both you and your father were at boarding school, and then both of you were kind of set free to be intellectuals and writers. And do you think that there's something to the fact that when you're at boarding school, there's all these kind of tight behavioral and limitations and stuff, and then your mind becomes kind of starts circumventing and finds its own way out?
That's an interesting question. So I just don't compare myself with my dad at all. I don't feel I'm at all in his league in that sense. So I don't, I don't know how much that's the case. I think that, when I was in school and as I came out of school, I always had the thought that I would marry an ugly man, because who else would have me, and be a mom and raise children, because that's just what I thought I was capable of. And as it turned out, I married, I've been married twice, and both of my husbands have been very attractive, and much to my amazement. And I did have 2 children, and so that was kind of like my trajectory for a long time. And it wasn't until I was much older, I went to, my kids were in high school, and I went back to school, and I studied at New College of California, and I studied with Virginia Satir, who was an amazing teacher who had brought conjoint family therapy. She brought the model of, that there's not an identified patient; it's a family system, and so she taught that, and so that was very powerful and deep work. And I had a lot of my own healing work to do from my own childhood, so I did that, and from that experience, I developed a workshop, which has morphed into now a workshop called Reclaiming Your Authentic Self, which I do every year at Esalen. And it's, it's a conglomeration of the tools that I learned and used that really made a difference for me, and helped me to be a more potent human being. And then the other thing that I did was I went to a workshop. A man that I was dating at the time had kept telling me about these workshops led by Stan Dale. And I thought, well, if these are so important to you, I should go and see what it's all about. And so I did my first workshop in 1983 with Stan Dale, and in what has become the Human Awareness Institute in Zen. And wow, talk about transformative.
Let me ask you. Let me ask you a quick follow-up about
Yeah.
the regaining your authentic self workshop, which is fantastic. Being so when there's kind of a star in a family, like your father was a star, and he was definitely his essential self, his true self, and it was shining so brightly. Did you feel like the fact that there's somebody near who is so full of the like the essential self, they can overshine and shadow over people around them, and then the people near them start to lose themselves and don't know who they are?
That's an interesting cause and effect question. Um, I suppose to some degree. I mean, for instance, my experience with my dad was that he could out-talk me on any subject.
Hmm.
And so oftentimes I would stop. And I know he didn't mean to do that, but he did it.
Mm-hmm.
and like his own beliefs about something would be so strong. And so then I would just go quiet. And I think that was something that I carried with me into adulthood, that business of going quiet and kind of disappearing and not putting myself forward. So in that sense, I would say that could be so.
Back to your childhood. So you were at boarding school. You went to California to spend time to live with your father. Was it like a hippie atmosphere? Were there a lot of interesting people in your house? Did that inspire you or make you feel uncomfortable?
Yeah, my father's household wasn't, at the time I was living with him, it was not like a hippie kind of place.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely there were always very interesting people in his life. And, I met a lot of interesting people through him, and I appreciated that. And I actually felt comfortable. I didn't feel uncomfortable.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
And now your work, the inner child and the authentic self, you do those, you say you do them once or several times a year. And Essen, is there other places where people can sign up and get this knowledge from you?
I do these workshops once a year at Esalen. It's a 5-day workshop. Esalen Institute, ESALEN Institute in Big Sur, California. And again, this is a place where my father used to teach. And I never imagined myself being a teacher there, and now here I am. It's pretty interesting. And this workshop I limit to 10 participants because we go so deep in the work that we do.
Hmm.
And my participants tell me again and again how much they appreciate it. So that way everyone gets, fully involved, and gets their time and attention. And I think I said that we do several different modalities of healing work, so that not one thing works for all people, and so people get an opportunity to see what works for them, and they're all tools that they can take home and keep working with. So.
Now, are you planning to write any books about these two topics? And also, when you have these annual workshops and people go through their deep work and you go through it again, do you always learn new ways of healing yourself?
Frequently I do, absolutely. And I do private work with private clients, and, and sometimes they're working on exactly what I'm working on. So It just feels like, yeah, right. I'm getting this right along with you. And so, absolutely, that's a thing. I just have to be very clear that I keep my stuff separate from their stuff, right? What was the other piece of that?
The other question is, have you considered writing about these two topics?
Oh, right. How interesting that I forgot that part. I have an enormous resistance to writing. And I know, again, this is part of my childhood stuff. With a father who was a famous, well-known writer, and I developed this story that it's all been said, and it's all been said better than I could say it, and then so I notice every time I try to write, it's like pulling nails. It's just like it's really torturous for me, and so it's some people have a natural proclivity for writing. It's like they just can't stop themselves, which was my dad. He could not stop himself, and it's so funny. In several of his letters, he's apologizing for writing so much because he just had so much to say. And I tend to be quieter and am more of somebody who responds to a stimulus rather than one who creates the stimulus. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes. It makes great sense. It actually leads perfectly to my next question about charisma. Charisma, magnetism, and the unconscious. I want to bring those topics up and ask you both about you and your father. Now, when your father was in a room or when he was in his house or wherever he happened to be, the charisma, what was it like? How would you describe it? What kind of magnetism did he have as a person? What kind of charisma do you feel you have? And also the connection to the unconscious. Do you think all of those writings came from another place? Was it similar to the unconscious, or did it come from thinking?
Wow. A lot of his work, I think, came from thinking. However, he was a deeply intuitive person, and often knew things that other people might not know or expect. For instance, one of our mutual friends saw him at some point for some counseling support. And she said during their session, there was this moment when he reached out and he put his hand on her knee and he said, I want you to just be prepared and don't be afraid. We're about to have an earthquake. And sure enough, that was followed by an earthquake. And that was a story. I've heard other stories of a similar nature from people about their experience with my father. So, from my perspective, there was definitely something else going on there. So I couldn't tell you how much of his work is channeled or otherwise. About myself, I have this sense, sometimes I have this little story that I make up, that my higher self and my client's higher self have a conversation. And that somehow something comes out of my mouth that I don't know where it comes from. But it's just what my client needs, right, to move forward or to do some shift in themselves. And so, when I'm doing my inner child work, I say to people that all of us have a part of us, which I call our inner wise one, that's connected to the wisdom of the universe. And that we can tune into that. And so I will have their wise one and their child interact. That's like the first step. because the wise one, I say, knows you better than any other human being on the planet. And that's where they begin creating the kind of relationship that has them feeling safe, heard, important, cared for, all of that. That's a pretty easy thing for people to do.
It's
so,
in a
is
way.
that answering your question?
Oh yeah, and in a way, it goes directly back to your book, because in a way, the child self and the wise self are writing letters to each other.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And
yeah.
now tell me about charisma and magnetism. How would you describe that?
Well, let's see. I would say my father was very charismatic. And, some of it was just in his voice and how he sounded. And people are very drawn to that voice. And so that's, and then just his way of being in a gathering, in a group of people. He was, like the word that comes to me, scintillating. People were really drawn to him, and he was drawn to them. Alan was very interested in other people and what made them tick, and he was very good at drawing people out. So that was a special quality that he had. So it was never all about him, although he was good at taking center stage, and he loved center stage. There's no doubt about it, which is why he called himself an entertainer.
Was there...
and that's the other thing. He never wanted to be called a guru or, like this person who knew all the answers, or, he saw himself as the fallible human being that he was. And he would try to get people to hear that and get that. And, my feeling is you put somebody on a pedestal and there's only one way they can go, and that's down, and so often when people have found out about Alan's frailties as a human being, his alcoholism and his addiction to women, then they want to say, oh, well, he's just trash because he didn't live what he preached, kind of thing. And I have to say that in many ways he absolutely did, but he never preached about how anybody ought to live their life. That wasn't it.
You brought up a very important subject, which is addiction, and not specifically with him, but addiction, and also kind of the sexual desire. What I personally believe, which is something really misunderstood in the society, is the fact that very creative people, including myself, sexuality can very much fuel the creativity. It takes you into a transcendent place. It's like fuel from which you can connect and create even stronger. Has your father ever discussed that or explained as to what was the need for that?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think he understood it himself. Mm-hmm. I think often he wished it were not so. He wished it could be different, but it wasn't different, and he didn't know how to make it different. Mm-hmm. And I think he did say that. And so I think there's some truth in what you're saying, because I witnessed that it's frequently a trait for people in high positions who are, sexuality is a very strong component of who they are and who they be, and often it's difficult for them to manage it in a way that feels, I guess for me, the thing that I always want people to do is to be respectful to the people that they're in relationship with.
I agree with you completely.
And that was one of my sadnesses with my father, that I feel like he was doing what he was doing, and he just it wasn't a conversation. It wasn't. There was nothing consensual or agreed upon about it, and I think that was one of his sadnesses, is that there was hurt in the wake of his addictions.
I see.
And
yes, consensual is always key. Absolutely. Let me ask you this question. Now, he had a total of 7 kids.
he did.
And now, somebody of that magnitude and charisma, they can treat the daughters and the sons differently from each other. Did you notice that? What was the main difference?
When I was with him, it was my sister and myself. And by the time the other family came along, that was just before the time that I moved to the UK. And so I don't really know how differently he treated the boys from the girls. I don't want to speak for my siblings.
Makes sense.
I know that they had some different experiences from the experiences that Joan and I had, because their circumstances were different. And so, I just don't feel equipped to speak for them.
I understand. Let me ask you a question about talismans. Did your father have a favorite talisman that provided him wisdom and strength and power? And did he ever give you one that you may feel comfortable sharing, or you don't have to, that you keep close and provides you with strength and archetypal power?
No. I don't. He never gave me any such thing, and that he never spoke of such a thing. I don't. I honestly don't think that would have been a something that he gave a lot of credence to.
Okay. Let me ask you about Zen Buddhism. Zen, first of all, how would you define Zen?
I wouldn't.
Okay.
I am not a student of Zen.
Okay.
And I haven't been. And so I don't pretend to or attempt to say that I have any authority or ideas in that area. Okay. I don't feel like I do.
There's another book that has just come out called Zen Odyssey.
Yes.
And this is about your grandmother.
Yes.
And how she, in a way, brought Zen Buddhism to the United States. Yes? Now that's very interesting too, and that's currently the #1 new release in the history of Buddhism on Amazon. Can you, so there's 2 books out, audience. Again, one book, which Anne co-edited, is called The Collected Letters of Alan Watts. And the other book, that came out just about a month after, is called Zen Odyssey, the story of Sokei-an. Sokei-an, Ruth Fuller Sasaki, and the Birth of Zen in America. Can you briefly tell us about this book?
This book was researched for a long time by Janica Anderson, the principal author. Her co-author was Stephen Schwartz, and she contacted everyone still living who knew my grandmother, and did extensive research. So the book is very factual, but it's written in a story fashion, because she really wants this book made into a movie, because my grandmother was such an extraordinary woman, and so she follows her life and the life of Sokei-an. How he first was sent by his superior to the U.S. to bring Buddha Zen to the U.S. And all of how that went, and then her own trips to Japan to study herself, and so over the years, she eventually became the first woman and the first foreigner accepted into the Zen priesthood in Japan. And she was given a temple at Daitokuji in Kyoto. And it's a fascinating story. And what's interesting, of course, is that the two stories overlap because her daughter was my mother. And it talks about when she and my mother went to London and went to the Buddhist Society in London where they met my father. And so there's a lot of interweaving. And Sokei-an was one of the early people that my father reached out to in his letters to talk about what is Zen and all of that. And so Sokei-an was an early teacher for my father. So it's really a lot of fun and to read them both.
Do you? It's very interesting how your father and your grandmother brought this to this country in different ways, to America. Do you feel like it's some kind of a balance factor to capitalism and the fact that it's such a materialistic society? Do you think that Zen is kind of the counterpart to balance it out?
I could say that. Yeah, I do think that that the practice of deep meditation and letting go of attachment is very useful at a time like this, especially when there is so much stress for so many people going on. And so I think that it's a very helpful thing for people who are interested and want to take it on. Yeah.
When I receive kind of, let's say, soul messages, it's mostly at dawn time, right before the sun rises. I wake up and I just feel future things, artistic thoughts, and all these things. Is there a time when you're most connected to the other worlds?
When I'm in nature, I would say that's one of the times when I'm feel most connected, and the other time is when I'm working with people.
And
right?
Therefore your annual classes actually take care of both of those things because the location is in nature and you're working with people.
Right.
So.
Right, it's a stunning place. And, so I do that once a year, but then I'm doing workshops many times a year and in different parts of the world for the Human Awareness Institute. And we lead a series of workshops called Love, Intimacy, and Sexuality. And we lead them in many different countries, and they're weekend-long workshops. And, my experience in that is that really what we're teaching people is about love and how to really be in a place of love with themselves and with others. And so for me to be being love with a group of people is an extraordinary experience. And I feel so gifted to be able to do that again and again and again. It was a very healing experience for me when I did my first workshop, and I was so moved by that I took on the challenge to become a leader because it felt to me like such amazingly important work, and that was the last thing I ever would have imagined myself doing, as you know, from my projection of myself as a child.
That's wonderful that you've allowed your life to lead you in all of these ways and to be able to grow constantly and unexpectedly. Um,
Yeah.
what is the website for this organization?
It's called www.hai for Human Awareness Institute.org.
Okay, great.
And we are about to roll out a new website, I think around January 17th or so, a whole new website for people to get to see and go to.
Perfect.
So I'm excited to see what our organization has created.
So, dear audience, by the time you hear this, the new website will most likely be up. So it's hai.org.
Right.
You know, as we begin to wrap up the interview, which has been really fantastic, so I really am grateful that you're on the show. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
I want to ask you this question. You know, you mentioned when somebody's on a pedestal, there's no way to go but down. I want to ask you this. Sometimes when somebody's on a pedestal, they actually can become iconic. They can become kind of godly. And people
They
can
can become what with that?
kind of godly. A religion or something similar can start around a person or a person's thoughts. I'm wondering if in the future, perhaps, there would be an Alan Watts kind of similar thing to a religion. How would you feel about that?
My first reaction is to gag.
Okay. That's
You know,
great.
I'm so not into that.
Mm-hmm.
My work with people is to say, you are equal to anybody on this planet,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
We're all equal, and different ones of us have different strengths and talents.
Great.
And so, again, like my father, I'm not into the guru thing. I just, and you know, part of that is when I was younger, and people would find out who my father was. There was one woman who asked if she could touch me, and for me, that was nauseating. It was just like over the top, you know, just ridiculous. And I want to say the thing about talismans, too. Talismans can have their place, but my concern about that is, what if you lose your talisman? If you put your faith in that thing rather than in yourself, I feel like that's risky business. You know, I mean, I think we all have things that are comforting to us and precious to us, but it's also useful not to be attached to them. Living in Santa Rosa, we were threatened by these fires recently. And when the fires started, I had just done a workshop in Boston, in the Boston area, and as I got on the plane, I talked to my husband, and he told me about the fires. And there was this moment on the flight when I felt like I had to release everything I owned, you know, because we could have lost everything, and many people did. And so, you know, I feel like our ability to let go and move forward is really important. And so I'm not a big one on this whole business of idolizing people, or, I mean, I think it's wonderful to learn. My father has made such a difference in so many lives all over the planet. I've just been having emails with a young man from, can't remember if it's Denmark or Sweden, 15 years old, and he's discovered Alan Watts. And you know, that's being transformative for him. And I love that. I think that's beautiful and extraordinary. And, you know, while my grandmother, who was a very serious, very by-the-book scholar, and very principled in her practice of Zen, she did some very deep work for people who are deeply into Zen. And she translated works from Chinese into English, which is so helpful for people who are deeply into that study. Whereas Alan, she's hardly heard of at all, right? And Alan and his work was very, very popular. And so he inspired people to enrich their lives, and he had a very different way about it, which I think is suited to a larger group of people than the people who go into that very deep, very intense study. And so, you know,
Great.
they've each done something very powerful and very useful for the world in their own way, which I think is wonderful.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great way to complete the episode. Thank you for speaking with us, Ann Watts. And the book, again, is called The Collected Letters of Alan Watts. And the websites that you can check out are hai.org and Ann Watts' website, which is annwatts.com. Thank you for being on the show.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me.